The battle was already over. We just had not accepted it yet. I was dictating into my personal log when the last engine on the Concordance went dark. No warning light. No alarm. Just silence. The kind that settles into your bones when a ship that has been humming beneath your feet for 3 years suddenly stops breathing. Commander Seiya Okafor, Senior Surviving Officer. Flagship of the Galactic Allied Council's 7th Combined Fleet. 17 ships still responding on comms. 11 with any power left to speak of. The Velthari Dominion had been moving for 6 hours to encircle us, and now they had finished. 9,000 ships in a ring so perfect it almost looked like something you would frame and hang on a wall. I kept talking into the log anyway. Old habit. My grandmother used to say that the worst thing about a crisis was going quiet. Quiet meant you had given up thinking, and you should never give up thinking, even when thinking could not save you. Log entry. Commander Seiya Okafor. Day 941 of the Velthari campaign. Current position, the Thresh Crossing debris field, approximately 2 light minutes from the 4th moon of Thresh Prime. Fleet status, critical. Casualties from the past 16 hours of engagement exceed 60% of total Joint Fleet personnel. The offensive operation designated Hammer Reach has failed. What was planned as a decisive push into Velthari staging territory is now a trap, and we are inside it. I paused. I looked through the cracked viewport at the darkness outside, at the distant, cold light of Velthari vessel arrays forming up. They were not even rushing. That was the worst part. They were methodical, patient. They had all the time in the universe, and we had maybe 40 minutes before they decided to stop watching us struggle and finish this. The Galactic Allied Council has been at war with the Velthari Dominion for 3 years, 2 months, and 14 days. In that time, we have lost 4 colony systems, 2 established relay stations, and roughly a third of the combined active military personnel from all 9 member species. The Velthari fight with numbers. They do not have a single ship class that matches ours in raw firepower. But they breed fast, they build fast, and they have shown a remarkable willingness to throw enormous quantities of everything at any problem until the problem goes away. We have been the problem. We are going out like one. Counselor Voss appeared in the doorway of what remained of the command deck. He was Drathani, which meant he stood about 2 meters tall, had 4 arms he used with exhausting efficiency, and possessed a facial structure that most humans found unsettling until they got used to it. I had gotten used to it. He was the best tactical mind on the ship, and right now his expression, even filtered through the translator implant behind my ear, told me everything. They are positioning for a final enclosure, he said. We have perhaps 38 minutes before the ring closes completely. I know. The surrender channel is open. Supreme Legate Nereth has transmitted terms. I know that too. Voss was quiet for a moment. Behind him, 4 other senior officers from the allied species stood in a loose cluster. Serathi, Prael, Kovan, and a single Omesi whose name I could never pronounce correctly, and who had stopped correcting me 3 months ago. They all looked at me. Not at Voss. At me. I had been the lowest-ranking senior officer at the start of this campaign. Technically, I was still the lowest-ranking one present, but there was something happening in that room, some quiet, wordless transfer of weight, and I understood it clearly, even if none of us said it out loud. What are the Velthari terms? I asked. Voss read them without expression. Disarmament. Withdrawal from 3 border sectors. Dismantling of 2 council shipyards. Regular inspections of Allied military installations for the next 100 years, and, at the bottom of the list, one item Voss read more slowly than the others: the removal of all human colonies from the outer expansion zones. The room was very quiet after that. They specifically listed us, I said. They did. Not the Drathani, not the Serathi, just us. Yes. I leaned back in the command chair, which had a crack running through the left armrest from where a piece of ceiling had fallen during the second Velthari assault wave. I looked at the ceiling, which had more cracks in it now, and I thought about what my grandmother had told me about the Unification Wars. Not the version in the history books, the version she had lived through. The version where the people who signed the peace agreements had been scared, tired, and running out of everything, and they had signed anyway, because the alternative was worse. She always said the hardest moment was not the fighting. It was the moment when you had to decide whether the people across from you were something you could eventually build with, or something that would never stop trying to end you. The Velthari terms answered that question with impressive clarity. There is a third option, I said. Voss looked at me. The others looked at me. I got up from the chair. My knee was bad from where I had been thrown into a console during hour 3 of the battle, and it reminded me of this every time I stood. I walked to the communications panel that was still operational, because by some miracle the communications array on the port side of the ship was the one system that had not been hit, which either meant we had the best and worst luck in the galaxy simultaneously, or the universe had a sense of storytelling. There is a beacon frequency, I said. Council Communications Protocol 44 Delta. It has never been used in the history of the Alliance. Every member species agreed at the founding of the Council that it would only be activated under one specific condition. Voss knew what I was referring to. I could see it in the way his posture changed. That frequency, he said carefully, was established as a last resort contact protocol. A signal for situations where conventional military options have been exhausted. Yes. It transmits specifically to human civilian networks. Yes. The Sarathi officer, whose name was Colonel Aran, stepped forward. Her people had been fighting wars longer than most species in the Alliance had been spacefaring, and she had a face that had seen enough to have stopped being surprised by most things. But she looked surprised now. Commander Okafor, she said, are you suggesting we activate a distress beacon that calls to people who are not soldiers? I am suggesting, I said, that we activate a distress beacon that calls to my species. The distinction matters. No one argued. That was the thing I remember most about that moment. Every senior officer in that room, from 5 different species, with centuries of combined military experience between them, looked at the ring of 9,000 Velthari ships closing around us, looked at me, and did not argue. I activated the beacon. The signal went out on frequency 44 Delta, carrying our position, our status, and a simple appended notation that is built into the protocol and cannot be removed. Allied forces in terminal position, all military options exhausted, requesting civilian reserve mobilization. The system confirmed transmission. Then it confirmed relay. Then it confirmed the signal had hit the nearest human network node, 6 light minutes away, and bounced from there across the human colonial web at speeds that made normal comms look like someone walking a letter across a field. I sat back down in the cracked command chair. Now we wait, I said. Voss was watching the Velthari formation on the tactical display. How long? He asked. I don't know exactly. What is coming? I thought about how to answer that. I had been thinking about it for the 30 seconds since I pressed the activation key, turning it over in my mind, trying to find a way to explain it to someone who had never grown up with it. The reserve was not something you could describe in a sentence. It was not a military body. It had no formal rank structure, no unified command in the traditional sense, no government budget line. It existed because roughly 4 billion adult humans, spread across every colony and station and deep space installation that humanity called home, had a standing arrangement with themselves. The arrangement was simple. If the signal ever goes out, you go. You take whatever you have that floats and flies, you strap whatever you own that fires onto it, and you go. No orders required, no draft notice, no government activation memo. Just a signal and a species that had decided, after a long and painful history of learning what happened when people did not show up for each other, that it would always show up. I tried to explain some of this to Voss. He listened carefully, as he always did, and when I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Volunteers, he said finally, in the same tone a person might use when encountering a word in a foreign language that sounds like it should be simple, but clearly is not. That is the closest word, yes. He looked back at the tactical display. The Velthari ring was tightening. 26 minutes left on the clock by my estimate. Will they come in time? He asked. I did not answer right away. I looked out the viewport at the dark, at the distant light of 9,000 enemy ships, at the silence of space between us and everything else. Yes, I said. I believed it. That was not bravery. That was not confidence. That was the deep, quiet certainty that comes from knowing your own people, their stubbornness, their absolute refusal to look at a situation and decide it is too hard. My grandmother had shown up for her neighbors when the flood came during the Kora Basin disaster. My mother had driven 600 kilometers through a storm to sit with a friend who had called her crying. I had watched humans, again and again, across every circumstance imaginable, make the same choice when things got bad enough. Not because someone told them to, because they could not stop themselves. On the tactical display, one of the Velthari outer ships began moving to close the final gap in the ring. Then, on the long-range sensor panel, a light came on that had not been on before. Then another, then 50, then more than I could count. The sensor officer, a young Prael named Irith, whose hands had been shaking for the past hour, looked up from the panel with an expression I had never seen on a Prael face before. They were not a species known for showing strong emotion, but his hands had stopped shaking. "Commander," he said, very quietly, "there are contacts on the long-range array. Many contacts. They are not Velthari." The communications panel crackled. A voice came through, clear and steady, with the faint background sound of a busy ship behind it. Young voice, calm. There was something in the tone that was almost amused, in the way that people are sometimes amused when they have just done something that is going to be a great story later. "Concordance. This is Reserve Flotilla Actual. We count approximately 9,000 Velthari vessels on our approach sensors. Is this a bad time?" I put my hand over my mouth for a moment, not to hide emotion, just to give myself 2 seconds to collect it. Then I opened the channel. "Reserve Flotilla Actual. This is Commander Okafor on the Concordance. Your timing," I said, "is exactly right." Outside the viewport, the darkness changed. Shapes began to appear in it. Hundreds of them. Then more than hundreds. They were not beautiful ships. They were not sleek military vessels with matching paint and uniform designs. They were cargo haulers with armor plating welded across their hulls at angles that an engineer at a shipyard would have found deeply offensive. They were colony transports with weapon mounts bolted onto the sides, the mounts slightly different on every ship, because every ship had used whatever parts were available when the signal came in. They were mining vessels with their extraction rail drivers still attached, now pointing outward. They were, in short, the most magnificent and improbable fleet I had ever seen in my life. Voss came to stand beside me at the viewport. He was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower than usual. "I have fought alongside 11 different species in my career," he said. "I have never seen anything like this." "No," I said, "you wouldn't have." On the tactical display, the Velthari ring had stopped moving. For the first time in 3 years of war, a Velthari formation had simply stopped. I updated my log. I kept it short. They came. That was all I wrote. It was enough. The reserve flotilla did not arrive the way a military fleet arrives. There was no tight formation, no coordinated approach vector, no signal from a command ship telling everyone where to go. What came through the outer boundary of the Thresh-crossing debris field looked, to anyone watching on a tactical display, like controlled chaos. But control and chaos are not opposites. Sometimes they are the same thing wearing different clothes. Admiral Castillo's voice came over the general channel almost immediately after the first wave entered sensor range. I had not known her before that moment. Her name was Nora Castillo, and she had been a commercial freight coordinator before the signal went out. She had also, it turned out, spent 15 years running reserve logistics drills on the side, which was the kind of thing that sounds like a hobby, until the moment it becomes the most important thing anyone in your vicinity has ever done. "Concordance, I am transmitting our approach plan now," she said. "I want to be upfront that the word plan is being used loosely. We have roughly 400 functional ships in the first wave, another 300 coming in behind them, and the rest of the flotilla stringing in over the next 20 minutes. None of us have fought together before today. Most of us have not fought at all. What we have is numbers, some very creative engineering, and a collective refusal to accept the situation as it stands." Voss was reading the transmitted approach data beside me. His expression was doing something I could not fully interpret. "These ship configurations," he said slowly, "several of them have weapon systems mounted in positions that violate standard safety protocols." "Yes," I said. "The structural reinforcement on at least 40 vessels appears to have been done with materials that are not rated for combat conditions. Probably. One of these ships appears to be a passenger cruise liner. People use what they have." Voss looked at me. "How are they not afraid?" They are afraid, I said. They are just not letting it make the decision for them. What happened in the next hour was something that no tactical textbook in the Galactic Allied Council had any framework for describing. The Velthari Dominion had spent 3 years mapping Allied military behavior. They knew response times. They knew formation preferences. They had detailed models for how every Council species behaved under pressure, what choices they made when options narrowed, how they prioritized when everything was bad. Their models were good. They had been right often enough to trap us at Thresh Crossing, to bleed the combined fleet down to 11 ships in a ring that was supposed to be a killing field. But their models were built on a simple assumption, that the entity fighting them would behave rationally under pressure, that when conditions became extreme, behavior would become predictable, because survival instinct narrows choices, and narrowed choices produce patterns, and patterns can be modeled and countered. No one had told the reserve. The first engagement wave came in at an angle that made no tactical sense on paper. 3 large cargo haulers led the approach, which should have made them easy targets. But they were not trying to engage. They were transmitting a cascade of ghost signals from their sensor arrays, a technique that apparently one of the hauler captains had worked out during the approach, sharing it with the other 2 by voice channel, 15 minutes before they arrived. The Velthari forward screen fired at 17 different ghost contacts before realizing none of them were real. By then, the actual approach wave was already inside their optimal response range. What followed was not elegant. I want to be clear about that. There was nothing beautiful about it. Ships got hit. Some went dark. A few broke apart. The reserve paid a real price. And I watched the loss counter on the tactical display with something sitting heavily in my chest every time a contact disappeared. These were not soldiers. They were people who had come anyway. And the difference between those 2 things is sometimes very small, and sometimes the whole world. But the Velthari formation was designed to process a certain kind of threat. It was designed to absorb an organized military push, counter it with superior numbers, and methodically eliminate the opposition. It was not designed for what the reserve did. A mining vessel came in along a trajectory that should have gotten it destroyed in the first 30 seconds, but its captain apparently decided that if they were going through fast, and they pushed the drive to 140% of rated capacity, which is the kind of decision that makes engineers weep, and used the velocity to punch through the outer screen before anyone on the Velthari side finished calculating the intercept. 30 other reserve ships followed that gap before it closed, not because anyone ordered them to, because they saw it and went. The coordination was informal, improvised, and somehow completely consistent. I watched it on the display and tried to understand what I was seeing, and eventually I stopped trying to analyze it and just watched it, the way you sometimes have to step back from something to see it properly. They are not following a battle plan, Voss said beside me. He did not say it as a criticism. He said it the way you say something when you are trying to process a fact that does not fit any category you currently have. No, I said. They are following each other. There is a difference. He was quiet for a moment. They trust each other, people they have never met. Yes. Why? I thought about it. Because they all showed up for the same reason. When you know why someone is standing next to you, you do not need to have met them before. Colonel Oren, the Sarathi officer, had been watching the engagement display in complete silence for the better part of 40 minutes. Sarathi were not a quiet people by nature. They had opinions about most things, and expressed them with confidence. But she had not said a word since the reserve arrived. Now she spoke, very quietly, not to me but to the room. The Velthari outer screen is contracting, she said. They are pulling the forward units back. I looked at the display. She was right. The Velthari formation, which had been an encircling ring for the past 6 hours, was changing shape, not retreating, not advancing, pulling inward, closing ranks, like something that has decided it needs to protect itself from a threat it did not anticipate. Their formation, Voss said, reading the tactical data, is designed for offensive encirclement. They are reconfiguring for a defensive posture. They have not done that once in 3 years, Oren said. No, I agreed. What does it mean? Asked Irith, the young Prail sensor officer, who had been listening to all of this with wide, attentive eyes. I looked at the display. I looked at the reserve ships weaving through the outer Velthari screen in patterns that were equal parts strategy and improvisation. I looked at the Velthari formation pulling back from its perfect killing ring into something that looked, for the first time in this entire campaign, uncertain. It means they are not sure what they are dealing with, I said. And that is the first time in 3 years that has been true. Castillo's voice came back on the channel. Concordance. We have pushed their outer screen back approximately 12,000 kilometers on the port axis. We are holding, but I want to be honest with you. We cannot sustain pressure across the full engagement envelope indefinitely. Some of our ships are not in great shape. Understood, Admiral. Can you maintain current position? We can. I would also like to note that their command cluster has gone quiet on all frequencies for the past 8 minutes. In my experience, that is either very good or very bad. In my experience, it was also one of those things. I looked at Voss, who looked at me. Then something happened that none of us expected. The Velthari command frequency opened. Not on a tactical channel, not on a standard military communications band. On the open diplomatic frequency that, by council law, no party to a conflict was permitted to jam or ignore. A voice came through, controlled, precise, speaking in the universal translation standard with the kind of care that suggests the speaker is choosing every word deliberately. Allied Command Vessel. This is Supreme Legate Nareth, of the Velthari Dominion Command Authority. I am requesting a temporary cessation of active engagement. I am requesting direct communication with the human officer aboard your vessel. The room was so quiet I could hear the hum of the one remaining operational cooling system. Oren turned to look at me. Voss turned to look at me. Irith turned to look at me. Everyone in the room turned to look at me. She asked for you specifically, Voss said. I heard. She has never asked for a specific officer in any engagement in this war. I know. She is the second highest authority in the Velthari Dominion. She has never communicated directly with any allied officer below Fleet Admiral rank. I looked at my rank insignia. Commander, not Fleet Admiral. I suppose, I said, that today is a day for new things. I opened the channel. Supreme Legate Nareth, this is Commander Saya Okafor, Allied Fleet. I am the senior human officer present. I am listening. There was a brief pause. Then the voice came back, and there was something in it that I had never heard in 3 years of intercepted Velthari communications. Not fear exactly, but something adjacent to it, something careful. The voice of a person who is very good at what they do, and has just encountered something their considerable skills did not prepare them for. Commander Okafor, I am requesting a pause in hostilities to discuss the current situation, not terms of surrender, a pause. Oren made a small sound. I understood why. In 3 years of war, the Velthari Dominion had never once requested a pause. They had demanded surrenders. They had transmitted terms. They had waited out retreats. They had never paused. I am willing to discuss a pause, I said, keeping my voice level. I will need a short period to consult with my allied officers. Understood. The pause is effective from this moment on our end. We will hold our position. I closed the channel. Castillo's voice came in immediately on the reserve comm line. Did the Velthari just ask for a timeout? They did. A brief silence. Then, very quietly, what sounded like suppressed laughter from somewhere in the background of her ship. Well, she said, that's a first. I turned to face the room. 5 allied officers, 5 different species, all watching me. We are going to talk to them, I said, and we are going to get this right. The meeting was arranged aboard the Concordance because the Concordance was, technically, the flagship of the Allied force, even if its engines were still offline, and its hull had enough new holes in it to give any reasonable shipwright a headache. Supreme Legate Nareth came over in a single vessel, no escort, which was either a gesture of good faith or the most controlled act of bravado I had ever seen from anyone, and I genuinely could not tell which. She was tall. Velthari tend to be. Their physiology runs lean and long, with a bone structure that makes them look like they were designed for a gravity well slightly lighter than the average habitable planet. Her skin had that deep gray-blue quality that Velthari show under stress, which I had only ever seen in intelligence files before. She wore no formal rank insignia, which was deliberate. She had come in as close to neutral as a supreme legate of the Velthari Dominion could manage. I met her at the airlock with Voss beside me, because Voss was the most senior allied officer after me. and also because his four arms tended to create an impression of calm authority that I found useful in tense moments. Nereth looked at me, then she looked at Voss, then she looked at me again. "You are the commander of this vessel," she said, not a question, a confirmation. "I am. You activated the Civilian Reserve Protocol." "I did." She held my gaze for a moment that lasted long enough that I had time to think about several things, including how strange it was to be standing face to face with the person who had given the operational orders for the Battle of Thresh Crossing, which had killed 60% of the people I had sailed with for 3 years. "I have questions," she said, "before we discuss terms." "That is fine," I said. "I probably have some too." We sat in what had been the senior officer's briefing room, which now had a long crack in one wall and several chairs that were bolted to the floor at slightly wrong angles because the floor itself had shifted during the battle. I did not apologize for the condition of the room. It seemed honest somehow. Voss, Arin, and the Omesi officer whose name I still could not pronounce sat on our side. Nareth sat alone on hers, which she had requested. She placed both long-fingered hands flat on the table and looked at them for a moment, as if organizing her thoughts, and then looked up at me. "I want to understand something," she said. "The vessels that came. We identified them. Cargo ships, passenger carriers, mining equipment, agricultural transport vessels. One ship in the fourth wave was registered as a mobile medical platform." "A hospital ship," I said. "Yes. These are not military assets." "No. They were not ordered to come." "No. There was no compulsory mobilization, no government directive, no emergency legislation activating reserve military duty. Not in the way you mean it, no. The beacon went out. They came." Nereth was quiet for a long moment. One of the things I noticed about her, in those first minutes, was that she was genuinely trying to understand. She was not performing confusion or negotiating strategically. She was actually trying to fit what she had witnessed into a framework that made sense, and the framework was not cooperating. "Why?" she asked. The room was quiet. I had spent 17 minutes since activating the beacon trying to answer that question for Counselor Voss. I had not fully succeeded, but I had had another hour or so to think about it, and I thought I had something closer to the truth now. "When I was young," I said, "my grandmother told me about the worst period in human history. Not the most violent, necessarily, the most dangerous, in a different way. She described a time, a few generations back, when humans had all the tools to help each other and kept finding reasons not to. When there was a disaster somewhere, people watched it happen from a safe distance and told themselves it was someone else's problem. She said the hardest thing about that period was not that people were cruel, it was that they were not cruel. They were just careful. They protected themselves. They made reasonable decisions. And they watched things fall apart anyway, because no individual reasonable decision added up to anyone actually showing up." Nereth had not moved. She was listening in the particular way of someone who is taking in every word, not just as language but as data. "We went through a long period of learning," I said. "As a species, most of it was painful. Some of it was catastrophic. But on the other side of it, humans made a collective decision that was not written into any law, not enforced by any government, not maintained by any penalty. The decision was simply that we would show up, for each other, because we had seen what happened when we did not." "The reserve protocol," Nereth said. "It is not compulsory." "No. But nearly every eligible adult human maintains the standing registration." "Yes? Why?" "Because it feels wrong not to," I said. "It is as simple as that. Not because someone will punish you if you don't. Because you have to live with yourself if you don't. And we decided, as a people, that we would rather take the risk of showing up than be safe, and no, we stayed away." Nereth looked at the table again, then at me. "Your species has a reputation," she said. "Among the Dominion's strategic analysts, you are documented as the most internally conflicted species in the known galactic community. Your historical record of conflict within your own civilization is extensive." "We know," I said. "You have gone to great lengths to harm your own people over differences of belief, of culture, of identity. The record is detailed." "Yes. And yet. And yet," I agreed. She folded her hands. In the Velthari Dominion, she said, we have a strategic classification for every allied species, a behavioral predictability index. Every species in your council sits within a calculated range of likely responses to any given situation. We have refined these models over 15 years. They have been accurate with a margin of error that I will not disclose, but that I assure you is very small. I waited. Humans are the only species in the database, Nareth said, where the model has a formal notation that reads, predictions unreliable under extreme conditions due to non-rational decision input. Non-rational, Voss said quietly. Meaning? Nareth looked at him. Meaning your species does not only calculate survival when making decisions under extreme pressure. It introduces variables that have no direct survival value. Loyalty to individuals you have never met. Principles that offer no material benefit. A consistent willingness to accept personal cost for abstract outcomes. She paused. In our strategic framework, this is classified as an instability marker, a flaw. The room was very quiet. And now? I asked. Nareth looked at me for a long time. Outside, through the damaged viewport, the reserve flotilla was still holding position, 400 repurposed ships sitting between us and 9,000 Velthari vessels. Now, she said, I am reconsidering the classification. She unfolded her hands and placed them flat on the table again. I am authorized by the Velthari Supreme Command to discuss a cessation framework, not terms of defeat. A cessation, what your council would call a peace negotiation. Voss made a quiet sound that, through my ear implant, translated as something between surprise and immense relief. I need to be clear about one thing, I said. Everyone looked at me. I will sit at this table, and I will work toward peace in good faith. But I am going to say something first that you may not expect. What the Reserve did today, what they sacrificed to come here, that was not a favor the Velthari Dominion owes us. It was not a debt you are paying off by offering peace. They came because we called, and we called because we were out of options and we believed in each other. That is the only reason. I leaned forward slightly. If we build peace here, we build it because it is right, because continuing this war produces nothing except more of what happened at Thresh Crossing today, on both sides. Not because you are afraid of what 400 cargo ships might do next, not because we are humiliating you, because we have both been at this long enough to know what it costs. The room was very quiet. Nareth looked at me, and then, slowly, something happened in her expression that I had no reference for in any intelligence file. It was not a smile. It was subtler than that. It was the look of someone who has just encountered a variable they did not know existed, and who is genuinely, against all expectation, glad to know it does. You are not what I was briefed to expect, she said. No, I said. We usually aren't. The negotiation took 11 days. I want to be honest about that, because stories about peace tend to skip past the actual making of it, the long hours of careful language, the moments when everything nearly fell apart over a single word in the translation matrix, the nights when I lay awake in my damaged quarters on the concordance, wondering if I was reading the situation right or making something worse. I had no formal diplomatic training. I had a command track education, a grandmother's stories, and a working understanding of what happened historically when wars ended, on terms that left one side with nothing but humiliation and a countdown until the next one. That understanding turned out to be more useful than I expected. The Allied Council sent a proper diplomatic team on day 3. They arrived aboard a fast courier ship with 4 accredited ambassadors, a staff of 30, and a very polite but pointed communication to me, suggesting that perhaps the actual trained diplomats could take over from here. I read the communication, acknowledged it, and then asked Admiral Castillo, who had moved her command to a position just outside the Concordance's damaged docking bay, whether the reserve had any opinions. Castillo's response was brief. We came this far, she said. You'd better see it through. I sent a politely worded reply to the council, indicating that I would happily consult with the diplomatic team and would incorporate their guidance, and that I intended to remain at the table. The council's lead ambassador, a Drathani named Councillor Preth who had spent 40 years in formal diplomacy, and had visible feelings about a human commander with a cracked command chair running a peace negotiation with the enemy, sat beside Voss for the remaining 8 days, and occasionally passed me notes. Some of the notes were genuinely helpful. Nareth and I developed, over those 11 days, something that was not quite friendship, and was not quite trust, but was something in between, that does not have a clean name. Respect, maybe, of the specific kind that forms when two people who have been on opposite sides of something terrible sit long enough in the same room to understand that the other person is not simple. On day 6, during a recess, she asked me about the reserve protocol again, not the mechanics of it, the feeling of it. When the beacon activated, she said, "And your people began to come, did you know they would?" "I believed they would," I said. "There is a difference." "What is the difference?" I thought about it. Knowing is a calculation. Believing is something you carry inside you that does not depend on the calculation working out. I believed they would come because I know my people. Not every individual, not even most individuals, but the shape of us, collectively. What we do when something is genuinely at stake. And if they had not come, then I would have been wrong, and we would have died in the Thresh-crossing debris field, and the beacon would have been the last thing I ever activated. I looked at the table. But I was not wrong. Nareth considered this. In Velthari culture, she said, certainty is the basis of action. We do not commit to an operation without a calculated probability of success, above a defined threshold. What you are describing, acting on belief without calculated certainty, is not something our command structure has a framework for. How has that worked for you? I asked. A pause. We have been very successful against predictable opponents, she said carefully. Yes, I said. I noticed. On day 9, the framework of the agreement took shape. It was not a perfect document. No peace agreement that is actually going to hold is a perfect document, because perfect documents are written for perfect conditions, and conditions are never perfect. It was honest. It acknowledged what both sides had done. It did not pretend either party was innocent of the costs of the war. It established withdrawal timelines, zone boundaries, and a joint observation commission with representatives from all 10 of the species involved, because someone, and I will admit it was me, had the idea of putting a Velthari representative on the commission alongside allied members, which caused a 40-minute argument and then, eventually, a quiet acknowledgement from Nareth that it was not the worst idea she had encountered in 11 days. On day 10, one of the allied ambassadors passed me a note that read simply, "You are better at this than you should be." I passed the note back with a reply, "I had a good grandmother." On day 11, we signed it. Every officer present, allied and Velthari, added their notation to the document. I signed last, because I was the lowest-ranking senior officer in the room, and I had decided that this was one protocol I was going to follow. My notation sat at the bottom of the page, in small, clear letters. Saya Okafor, Commander, Galactic Allied Council, Human Species. After the signing, Nareth remained at the table while the others filed out. I remained too. It seemed right. "One more question," she said, privately. "Yes. Your species, internally conflicted, a long history of damaging yourselves and each other, capable of great loyalty and great cruelty, sometimes simultaneously. How do you live with all of that?" I thought about it for a long time. I thought about my grandmother, who had lived through things that had no good names, and who had still, at the end, believed that people were worth showing up for. I thought about the reserve ships, the patched and jury-rigged and deeply impractical fleet that had come through a debris field because a signal went out and they had decided to answer it. I thought about Voss, who had said volunteers in the tone of a man, encountering a word that was bigger than its letters. I thought about all the names on the ship's loss roster that I was going to have to read when this was over. "We do not live with it," I said. "We live through it. There is a difference." Nareth looked at me. Then she reached into the fold of her formal garment and produced a small card. She set it on the table in front of me. On it was a single Velthari glyph, hand-drawn in what I would later learn was a formal ink the Velthari reserve for documents of permanent record. "This is the notation our strategic analysts place beside a variable they have stopped trying to predict," she said. "I thought you should have it." She stood. inclined her head in the Velthari gesture that means something between respect and acknowledgement, and walked out of the room. I looked at the glyph for a long time. Then I picked it up and put it in my pocket. The Council formally elevated humanity to senior partnership status on the third day after the peace signing. The vote was unanimous, which meant even the Omesi voted yes, which I had not been entirely certain about, given that their species communicates through a system that requires 3 translators and a color decoder, and I had never been fully certain any of them understood what was happening in the room at any given moment. I was not present for the vote. I was on the observation deck of the Concordance, which was the one section of the ship that had good viewport glass and minimal hull damage, watching the reserve flotilla prepare to head home. They were leaving the way they had arrived, informally, in no particular formation, ships peeling off in different directions as their various routes home required. A cargo hauler that had come from the Brennan system went one way, a mining vessel from the outer Kale stations went another. The hospital ship, which had spent the 11 days of negotiation providing medical care to injured personnel from 7 different species, without anyone having to ask it to, was the last to go. I watched it until I could not see it anymore. Voss found me there. He came and stood beside me and looked out the viewport at the thinning formation. The Council wants to hold a formal ceremony, he said, to recognize the reserve's contribution. Medals, commendations, a permanent record in the Allied Historical Archive. I know. I received the same message. Admiral Castillo's response to the invitation was, he paused, brief. I smiled. What did she say? She said, and I am translating carefully, that the reserve did not come for medals, and that a hot meal and a working shower would be more useful to her crew than a ceremony, but that she appreciated the thought. I laughed. It came out more genuine than I expected. It had been a while since anything had come out that way. That is very accurate, I said. That is exactly who we are. Voss was quiet for a moment. He had 4 arms, and he used 2 of them now in the Drethani gesture that means something like a formal acknowledgement, and 2 more in the gesture that means something closer to personal warmth. It was, I had learned, a combination the Drethani reserved for significant moments. In my language, he said, there is a word, shieldkin. It refers to a being who chooses, freely, to stand between harm and others, not because of obligation, but because they cannot bear not to. I have heard that word, I said. Colonel Aren mentioned it. It is the highest term my people use. It is not given lightly. He looked at me. I wanted you to know that it has been given, to your species, formally, by consensus of the Allied members present. And I looked back out the viewport. The last of the reserve ships was just a point of light now, joining the general spread of stars. Tell the Council, I said, that we accept, and that we will try to deserve it. Voss inclined his head and left. I stayed on the observation deck for a long time after that, until the reserve flotilla was entirely gone, and the viewport showed nothing but stars, and the distant glow of Thresh Prime's 4th moon, which had been a battlefield 2 weeks ago, and was now, slowly, going back to being just a moon. I went back to my quarters eventually. They were small, dented, and smelled slightly of the emergency sealant that had been applied to a hairline crack in the outer wall. On my desk, where I had left it, was the card with the Velthari glyph. Beside it was a photograph I had carried with me since my first posting. My grandmother, standing in front of her house after the Kora Basin flood, her boots muddy, her arms around 2 neighbors she had helped carry out of the water. She was grinning in the photograph. She always grinned after things that had cost her something. She said it was the only appropriate response to surviving something hard. I picked up the card with the Velthari glyph. I looked at it and I looked at her photograph, and I thought about what it meant to be a species that had spent so much of its history hurting itself, and then had turned around and done this. Not perfectly, not cleanly, with too many losses and a cracked command chair and a peace agreement that was going to need years of careful maintenance, but done it. I went to the small supply locker and found the last remaining piece of adhesive mounting strip, the kind you use to hang things on walls in low-gravity environments without drilling holes. I used it to put the photograph on the wall to the left of my bunk, where I could see it from where I lay. Then I used the last of the strip to put the Velthari glyph up beside it. The 2 of them sat there together, the grinning woman in her muddy boots, and the symbol for a variable that could no longer be predicted. I looked at them for a while. Then I opened my log for the last time since this had all begun, and I said the only thing that felt true enough to say. My grandmother would have found the whole thing hilarious. She would also have been the first name on the reserve manifest. That is the thing about us. We are both. We are always both. And maybe that is exactly what we needed to be. I closed the log. I went to sleep. For the first time in 952 days, I slept without dreaming of the battle.